In this week's video, I'm turning the base of a porcelain serving dish, and thereafter I'll show you how I recycle all of the trimmings that I remove during this process. One of my favourite things about this material, in comparison to the high iron stoneware body I normally use, is the sheer finesse and delicacy which this smooth clay can be worked to. Edges feel sharper, flat surfaces can be made smoother, and as the material, once fired, becomes quite translucent, I'm always driven to trim it very fine. That way, not only will the object be very light, but light will also pass through the walls of the pot, like semi-opaque glass. Initially I wasn't happy with the interior curve of this pot, hence why I skimmed over it with a metal kidney earlier. And then, to refine the rim, I'm using a flat-edged tungsten carbide turning tool just to refine this outer flange, and to make the edges nice and crisp. These trimming tools, which are incredibly sharp and almost feel like an implement a dentist might use, are made by a master potter and toolmaker whose name is Jaejun Lee. I'll leave a link to his website and Instagram in the description below. I only ever use these tools when I'm trimming porcelain, as the coarsely bodied stoneware I normally use, which contains quite a lot of grog, can chip the edges of these blades, and equally they chatter almost uncontrollably when used against a rough surface. So I save them, like a treat, for when I'm working with porcelain. Once the inner portion of the bowl has been trimmed, I remove the lugs that were holding it down in place, and give the wheel a quick clean, as I don't want to place the dish back upside down onto pieces of clay that might embed themselves into the freshly turned rim. On darker days, I work with an LED light next to me, as my studio gets really dark and shadowy when overcast, and I find that when I'm trimming porcelain, it's a lot harder to see what I'm doing, especially when the light's bad. Initially, I don't secure the dish in place with any lugs of clay, as I want to be able to trim right down to the rim, and if there were any bits of porcelain down there, they'd simply get in the way. So, to keep the pot in place, I position a spinner on top of the pot, through which I'm pushing down really quite firmly, pinning the porcelain against the metal wheel head. It also helps that the pot is low and wide, and has some weight to it anyway, and this probably isn't something I'd do with a form that's both narrow and tall, as without the use of a chuck or attaching the vessel down with some slip, which you often see me doing, there's a high chance it would just tip over. Now that the underside of the flange has been turned, and some of the curved wall has been too, I'll move on to the foot ring itself, which, for these, is where a majority of the work comes in. I begin by trimming two facets into the foot ring, which creates a sort of groove, which will act as a glaze catch later on. It's at this point that I remove the spinner and secure the dish back in place with 3 lumps of soft porcelain, as I don't need to trim near the rim anymore, and a majority of my work will be focused on this portion of the wall and on the top of the pot itself, where I hollow out the footwell. The aim when trimming a pot is to make it so the cross-section is more or less even throughout the entire piece. I don't want a pot that has thin walls and then a thick base, as not only will you be able to feel these inconsistencies when you pick up the vessel, but having highly contrasting areas of thickness is often what causes pots to crack as they dry and fire, as they heat up and down at different rates and shrink at different rates too. Once the sides of the pot have been trimmed, I'll begin working on the foot, and as you can hear, this smooth, leather-hard porcelain squeals a bit beneath the blade. I start by turning the bottom to be entirely flat, and this is also the moment that, if I notice the foot ring is too tall proportionally for the whole vessel, I'll trim it down and make it shorter. In this instance it was fine, so I simply proceeded with hollowing out the footwell, which I do by using the sharp edges and corner of this particular blade. When I really want to remove a lot of mass very quickly, I don't use the long edge of the blade itself. Rather, I focus my pressure into using just the sharp tip of the blade or the corner that makes up the hook of this particular tool. And you'll see that I'm applying pressure onto the blade itself, not only with my right hand that holds the tool, but with the fingers of my left hand too. And in the same moment I brace both my hands together as I turn, as well as really tuck them firmly into my torso and lean them on the plastic of the wheel tray. And all of this is done to add stability to the blade as I move it back and forth and dig it deeper into the footwell. This certainly isn't a process I rush, although I'm sure there are potters who do it faster. For myself, this particular shape isn't one I'm well versed in, I've probably made it a handful of times, as opposed to the bowls I've made thousands of, which I trim much more vigorously than these. I also find that I trim a bit more slowly too, whenever I use porcelain, as I'm just not that used to using the material, especially in comparison to the stoneware body I normally use, so I am perhaps a bit more careful than I usually might be. One thing I like when trimming a slightly grogged clay, be it porcelain or stoneware, is the reactionary nature of the coarse clay hitting the blade itself. It produces a certain sound, a grating, which I think I've sort of trained my ear to listen out to, just to confirm that the clay is actually being trimmed away. Whereas this porcelain is so smooth that sometimes there's practically no noise that's created, and that, in combination with the blade itself moving a lot more smoothly through the material, can make it quite easy to get lost as you're working, if you don't pay full attention. Ideally, I want the level of this foot ring to be at the same height the walls of the bowl meet the foot on the outside of the foot ring. Visually that's what works, and if the level of the footwell remains too high, the pot can look and feel a bit clumsy. Visually it'll look, at least with a trained eye, as if there's material left in the pot which needs to be removed, and it'll likely be heavier than needs be. With hand-thrown tableware especially, an awful lot of the pot's mass is removed at this trimming stage, especially for larger bowls and dishes and dinner plates. If you are trimming the feet of pots, you'll often remove up to a third or even a half of the original thrown weight. After I'm done using my larger loop turning tool, I switch back to one of Jaejun Lee's finer instruments. These razor-sharp blades leave a lovely smooth surface on the porcelain, although I would say they come with quite a high learning curve to them. With a normal, relatively blunt turning tool, a mistake might gouge away a tiny bit of clay and leave an unpleasant mark, whereas if this blade catches, it can tear huge chunks out of the vessels and rip the whole pot off centre, not to mention the possibility of cutting oneself with the blade's edge. It's probably for that reason that I wouldn't recommend them for beginners. Whilst they are fantastic to use, it's probably worth getting some practice under your belt with regular turning tools before you try something like this. Once the inner portion of the footwell has been trimmed deep enough, I tidy up the foot ring itself, trimming each of the 4 facets to be as smooth and well finished as the rest of the vessel, if not more so, as ultimately the bare clay on the foot will be the only clay that remains on view once the pot has been coated in glaze and fired. I then give the walls below one last trim, just to make sure the curve is just how I like it, and you can see at this point how dry the clay is as it comes off in quite small shards, and that's fine when working with porcelain, and in actual fact you'll often see porcelain trimmed when it's almost approaching the bone dry stage, which is just something you can't do with most stoneware clay bodies. And to get this corner just right, I switch to a little sharp loop tool, which just slightly rounds the indent in the corner, which should help the glaze that goes onto it sit a bit better. Finally, I take my porcelain maker's mark and push it into the leather hard clay, rocking it from corner to corner in situ and bracing it with a finger behind. And as this does displace a small amount of clay upward, I very briefly trim the top of the foot, just to ensure that it remains nice and flat, as a small bulge like that could be enough to cause the dish to rock and wobble when it's placed down on a tabletop. And that's the dish itself, more or less finished. For the time being anyway, it still needs to dry out, be bisque fired, glazed, and then glaze fired, which all in all, as I'm usually working on several hundred pots at the same time, can take a couple of weeks or even months. It's a simple dish, and one that's as light as a feather. And now I'll show you what I do with all those trimmings left over from this process. As I make, I typically keep my reclaim bucket directly to the left of my wheel. That way I can just scoop the trimmings straight in. My general rule for what goes into my reclaim bucket is as follows. If the trimmings are like this, and they're wafer thin, they're fine to go in. But if I have any larger lumps of porcelain that are still leather hard, then I'll let those dry out on the heater or in the sun until they're completely bone dry before I add them to the bucket, as leather hard lumps of clay that are still quite soft just won't break down into a fine slurry, or at least it takes a very long time for them to do so. I'll then cover all these trimmings with water, together with any slip or water left over from the stuff I've thrown with. I'll completely cover all of these turnings, and I'll leave them overnight or for a week, until the clay has slaked down into a really fine slurry. A few days later, once the clay has settled, I remove all the excess water on top and prepare my bats. These are made from plaster, and I raise them up on kiln props, which just helps to get some air circulating beneath them. I used to raise them up on slats of wood, but as this plaster absorbs all the moisture from the clay and gets so damp, the wood would often get quite mouldy. I also position my bats so they're next to the heater, and I pour out this thick porcelain slip in a thin layer, like so. It might seem like it takes a really long time to reclaim a full bucket's worth, but the dry plaster quickly absorbs much of the moisture out, and the heaters help too. And usually, in just a couple of hours, the clay is firm enough so I can just peel it away before adding another layer. I use a rubber kidney to do this, as opposed to a wooden or metal one, as sharp edges can chip the plaster, which might ultimately embed itself into the clay and cause lime pops, as the chunk of plaster in the clay absorbs moisture and expands. This can happen at the bisque stage, or it can happen even after the pot itself has been glaze fired, which usually results in a fragment of glaze chipping away from the pot. So I'm careful as I do this, and I only ever use very blunt instruments to scrape it off. I then take this clay over to the workbench, where I give it a quick wedge, but as it's still so soft, it doesn't have much integrity, so really this quick knead is just to bring it all together. I then take these lumps, and I'll set them aside on a slat of wood where they can dry out in the air over the rest of the day, or week, depending on how big the lump is, the weather, if the kilns have been on, and all manner of other things. For particularly large masses of soft clay, I roll them out into a long fat coil, which I'll then position in an arch shape together with the rest of the clay. This makes it have more surface area, so there's more air that can get around the soft lump of porcelain. And once these pieces have dried out, I'll give them one last proper wedge, and it's this final procedure that gets rid of any pockets of air and makes the lump one even, smooth texture, which is what's needed for any lump of clay that's thrown on the wheel. This process of reclaim means that practically none of the clay is wasted throughout this process, save the scraps my dog eats and runs away with. That's all for this week. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.